Hello, everyone. So, I want to illustrate the power of epidemiologic research. And what I mean by the power here is the opportunity for you to work with a population and continue to do research on that population, leading to more and more manuscripts. Now, you'll see that I only have a few true epidemiologic components to my study here, but because of the data that I was able to collect, I was also able to address some other research questions. So, how one study can have numerous research questions and papers. So, the primary purpose of some of the epidemiologic research I've done has been to look at preseason functional tests to see if they can help identify athletes at risk for injury. So in 2017, I invited 6 teams to our lab at George Fox University, and they're listed there. There's a mix of D2, NAIA, and D3. And I had also collected data from George Fox volleyball players the prior 2 years. So I had approximately 130 athletes participate. So, what was the testing procedure? So, the preseason test that I had performed was the diagnostic ultrasound. And so, one or two therapists perform the diagnostic ultrasound to the bilateral patellar tendons. Then we put people through a few different functional performance tests, the Y balance test, as well as the standing long jump and the single leg hop, and the lower extremity functional test, which is an agility drill test. And then in our motion capture lab, I had people perform the drop vertical jump from a 1 foot and 2 foot box height. Now, one of the first papers that I came up with that focused solely on volleyball players was this one looking at Division III athletes, and it's presented right here. Now, what I wanted to look at was, do the jump and hop tests discriminate injury risk? And so what I found was that athletes who had below 80% of their height for their standing long jump, below 70% of their height for the single leg hop on both legs, and if they presented with a side to side asymmetry when doing the single leg hop greater than 10%, those athletes had a 4.6 times risk of having any non contact time loss injury to the lower quadrant region and a six-fold increased risk of injury for the ankle and foot region. And again, these were non contact time loss injuries. Now, my primary question again was, can preseason functional performance tests help to discriminate injury risk? And so the study design that is used for that is a prospective cohort study. And we'll start talking about different study designs in the coming weeks. And the relative risk is the primary statistic that is used. But I also collected a lot of other data. And one research question is an athlete at a greater risk for jumper's knee or patellar tendinopathy based upon sonographic evidence of patellar tendon abnormality? So Cook et al. Had found that asymptomatic patellar tendinopathy having abnormal presentation on ultrasound imaging was a risk factor for elite junior basketball players. So we were able to do the same thing. We were able to look at the data and we were able to report the preseason prevalence being another epidemiologic study design. So we could present the prevalence of patellar tendon abnormality. So did the tendon look abnormal or not healthy? And we were able to report that there was no association between that preseason presentation of patellar tendon abnormality and the subsequent onset of symptomatic jumper's knee. So this is interesting. This study had both a prevalence component, looking at the percentage of people at baseline, and it had an incidence component. So we were reporting again the relative risk. Another functional performance test, looking at the Y balance test, and again, I can appreciate that we've got a diversity of students in this class. Not everybody knows these tests. That's okay. You can consider this a test for dynamic balance. The Y balance test was actually the brainchild of a graduate of Rocky Mountain University from its early days, Dr. Phil Plisky. And his first study looked at the star excursion balance test, and he found that a pattern in a Y shape was associated with a greater risk of injury. So if people had poor dynamic balance as measured by the star excursion balance test, well, he came up with the Y balance test in response to those findings. So, what was I able to do with the Y balance data? Well, at the bottom there, I was able to publish an epidemiologic study. So, looking at Y balance scores, they were not associated with time loss injury in volleyball players. I was also able to look at Y balance scores and compare them based upon competition level, player position, and starter status. Can preseason reactive strength index scores discriminate injury risk? So remember, I also had people do the drop vertical jump test, and we did it in our motion capture lab. And so we put the reflective markers on them. We had them drop onto force plates and then jump up from there. And so we found that actually a lower reactive strength index, which is essentially a measure of plyometric performance or one's kind of explosiveness, that power component, we found that people were 4.2 times more likely of having a non-contact lower quadrant region injury if they started the season with a lower reactive strength index compared to those who had a higher one. And we found that at the 1 foot box. We didn't find that at the 2 foot box, but the main reason we hadn't found that at the 2 foot box was because I didn't include the 2 foot box with the 2015 and 2016 cohorts. We added that in just for the 2017. What you can see is there's a trend towards it, because if we take a look here, there's this 14-2 relationship for all injuries. If we look at the large cohort, there was an 11-2 ratio here. So 3 of the individuals were not captured. And I imagine those 3 individuals again would have had lower drop vertical jump reactive strength index scores at the 2 foot height had we had tested them. We can also do some correlations. And so I had these reactive strength scores. And if you think about reactive strength as being something desirable for sport performance, well, does it correlate with game performance? And so, published in the Journal of Athletic Enhancement, we took a look at all the different player positions and the different scores, or I should say, the different offensive and defensive categories that were available, like kills per set, assists per set, digs per set, and things like that. And so we looked at correlating reactive strength index with those particular um, offensive and defensive statistics. And we found lots of different correlations. Some were small, so you can question if those are meaningful or not, and some were of a moderate size. But again, I'm just trying to illustrate that there are additional papers that you can do when you've got a set of data, and just kind of showing you options. And that's what I think is really exciting about epidemiologic type of research, because you can collect this large data set and then you can kind of mine that data set later. Here again was that one looking at the standing long jump and single leg hop as potential predictors of injury based upon preseason performance. And again, I already talked about that one there with those 4 to 6 times greater risk of injury depending upon which locations that we looked at. And then we did a validation study. So if we go back here, this one here was just of Division III athletes. And I looked at the standing long jump and single leg hop. Now, some of this data, and I didn't have this included in this, but when I did my dissertation, I had collected data from volleyball players as part of that. And so this was Again, going back many, many years, I looked at Division III athletes and found in these 82 individuals that there was a greater risk of injury based upon performance. So we did the same thing. I partnered with, again, some people from Azusa Pacific University, as well as the 100+ athletes I had collected over time. And what we tried to do was see, does this finding hold up? Now, remember, I had said previously the standing long jump and single leg hop, if there was poor scores below 80% of height, 70% of height, and an asymmetry, then that was a greater risk of injury. Well, what did we find here? We found that people that had lower standing long jump, lower bilateral single leg hops, again, below the 80%, below the 70%, and not if they had an asymmetry, but if they had had a prior history of injury, those individuals were 3 times more likely to go on and experience a time loss injury to the lower quadrant region, a non-contact time loss injury. So while it wasn't an exact validation, it shows that there is something there of concern. And I also looked at correlations between these preseason functional performance tests and game performance. And that paper there, again, looked at like the standing long jump, the single leg hop, the lower extremity functional test, which is an agility drill test. And so we were looking, do those tests help coaches potentially recognize athletic capabilities? And then a final paper here. This was many years in the making, looking at all the data I had ever collected, looking at prior history of anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction is associated with a greater risk of subsequent ACL injury. So I looked at all of the female soccer athletes, all the female basketball players, all the female volleyball players, some 330 plus individuals over many, many years of collecting standing long jump and single leg hop. I was looking to see, does the standing long jump and single leg hop, can those predict or identify people at risk for ACL injury? And the answer was no, those didn't really. But if somebody had a prior ACL reconstruction in high school or even early in college, they were at a much greater risk of having a subsequent ACL injury during their collegiate career. Okay, so as we look back over these, again, what was I trying to share? What was I trying to explain here? Well, if we look back, one study can have numerous research questions and papers. And again, my big thing was, can preseason functional tests identify athletes at risk? And from that, I was able to come up with not only epidemiologic studies, but also normative data studies and correlational studies.